Israel the Last Stylebender Adesanya. He's a talented fighter coming from a colorful kickboxing background. Now he eventually made his way into MMA, and in a shockingly short amount of time he managed to win the UFC middleweight title. Now along his journey he's put on some really fascinating performances, and at the time of this video he stands as the current middleweight champion. We're here today to explore just exactly how his fighting style functions and what makes him so effective. Stay tuned, because along my time studying this fight, I discovered several fascinating things you're gonna want to see. Adesanya has fought a lot since I've last covered him, so this is going to be an updated guide on his fighting style to look at his signature moves from what he does offensively, his defensive and counter moves, and lastly we're going to look at interesting moments when he managed to adapt to the opponent's strategy. Adesanya learned early in his career not to rush too hastily at opponents from his kickboxing days. This plays a big role in why he takes such a patient approach when he steps into the cage. He never really rushes in when an opponent is hurt, and he always calculates his shots appropriately. And because of this, it tends to take Adesanya a while to find his rhythm. He won't always finish someone early, but if the opponent gets reckless, he could definitely put them out for it. His patience is something important to understand, because his style is based off of reading opponents and carefully taking his shots. Now, if you enjoy a fighter who can carefully dissect their opponent, this is the kind of product that you get with the Last Stylebender. One of the trickiest things to deal with in striking might have to be the deceptive nature of feints. This is because feints present several problems. They offer different looks, come at different rhythms, and you never really know what to expect. This is what makes countering feints so difficult in the first place. The uncertainty becomes too difficult to plot against. A fighter who's subjected to various feints is very likely going to have issues trying to establish some kind of successful defensive rhythm. This happens to make Adesanya such a hard fighter to counter in the first place, and this is due to the fact that the bread and butter of his offensive game heavily relies on feint. He rarely throws his shots plain, and the shots that he does throw, it always comes out with some level of deceptive variance. From the very start of the fight, one of the first things Adesanya does is throw a variety of feints. The feints serve many purposes. They throw out defensive rhythms, they create openings, and they can also be used to bait opponents into counters. Whenever he feints, he takes the time to gather information and carefully read what the opponent does. This plays a role in why it can sometimes take Adesanya a while to establish a rhythm, but it pays off in the end, because you'll sometimes see an opponent's best weapon used against them when Adesanya manages to figure them out. And I have a few examples of this I'll show you soon enough. Adesanya uses a variety of feints, but they all follow the same principles to accomplish one goal: punish the opponent. Now take a look at one of his signature feints, his front step feint. Now this is a feint where he feints with a step forward and he pumps the lead hand. Feinting with your footwork creates the illusion that you're going to advance forward. Now this throws off the opponent's rhythm, because they'll react in a way that leaves defensive openings because they think you're coming forward. Now there's a few things to keep in mind here when Adesanya feints. First, he does this out of range in case they try to counter with this red line here. And as he feints, the opponent is unsure of how to react, because they're not quite in range to attack, and they're unsure if the attack is real or not. Now Adesanya feint steps, and he also pumps that lead hand. Now the opponent tries to reach for it, but Adesanya uses that timing to pop his jab into the opening that he creates. And right there, he pops in the jab. The next feint Adesanya likes to use is feinting with the hips. He likes to create the illusion that the threat of a kick is present, and then he transitions into a variety of other attacks like a jab or a cross. Now this feint style has a lot of utility because it feints a kick. Now keep in mind the opponent's defenses will change depending on whether a kick or a punch is coming. In Adesanya's fight with Brad Tavares, he actually managed to use the hip feint to disable one of Tavares' best attacks. During their fight, Adesanya managed to establish his long jab in order to fight at range, but Tavares actually started countering it with his own overhand. Adesanya mentions in his post-fight interviews that he knew he had to re-establish his jab, so this is where the hip feint comes in. Adesanya started throwing leg kicks, and what that did was that it brought Tavares' attention downstairs, and it brought his attention away from using the overhand. His attention was no longer drawn to Adesanya's jab, and by using the hip feint, he created the illusion of a kick that would attack his legs, but instead he would use that hip feint to transition into his jab and re-establish his jab once again. To emphasize his point, pay attention to Adesanya as he throws that leg kick. Now his opponent's attention is going to go downstairs. He can now use the hip feint he's about to do here in order to transition into his jab cross. Right there. Adesanya has a few go-to kicking tricks that he likes to use. Now the first one is a question mark kick. He usually likes to bait their attention low and then throw the question mark kick to go up top. Now the question mark kick is a little bit of a deceptive move since it looks like a kick that goes low but it loops back up towards the end right to the head. Opponents tend to defend low but leave openings when this happens. Another favorite of his is to throw the roundhouse kick and then chaining it into a cross. Now this tends to work well because opponents don't always expect a cross to come right after the roundhouse kick. And there's times where he'll also use a question mark kick and then chain it into a cross as well. And this one's another move he likes to do where he maintains wrist control and then he sneaks in his elbows. So by now you've seen some instances of Adesanya adapting to his opponent, but let's look at a few more examples here. Since Adesanya is such a measured fighter, he does a really good job of reading what the opponent does. Even when he's on the receiving end of his opponent's attacks, he somehow finds a way to counter or deal with it. When he fought Kelvin Gastelum, Adesanya was getting countered with Gastelum's signature counter. When Adesanya would throw his rear hand, Gastelum would slip and parry it out of the way, and then you come back up with his lead hook. He managed to drop Adesanya at some point. Down the line, Adesanya started to adapt and find ways to work around this. One way he dealt with this was by throwing a hook. Now Gastelum likes to slip his head off the center line sometimes, but when Adesanya threw his hook instead, it was in line with Gastelum's head position. There's a second way that Adesanya countered Gastelum's counter. In terms of rhythm, think of a beat as the time it takes for someone to finish throwing their cross. What Adesanya did was delay the timing of his cross. Instead of throwing it at a beat, he threw it at a beat and a half. So in other words, he threw the shot in a delayed manner. So Adesanya is going to posture forward, throw his cross, delay it for a split moment, and then finishes it off. And you're going to notice that Gastelum, he's going to miss the timing of his parry and eat the shot right down the middle. It's a good way to throw off their defensive rhythms. This is a very subtle move, but he tends to use this on other opponents as well. Israel Adesanya has a good understanding about the nuanced differences between striking and MMA and in kickboxing, and due to his fighting habits, his style is best suited for MMA from what his coaches suggest. He's mentioned on podcasts that he's aware of the smaller gloves and the fact that shots just get through easier when you're blocking. Likewise, due to the threat of takedowns, different rhythms in MMA, blocking tends to hold a lower precedence for defense in MMA since it puts you at higher risk for various attacks. It's a lot safer to evade danger in order to take away the opponent's offensive opportunities and their abilities to score. So as a result, you see Adesanya blocking as a last resort defense. He'll do it as a last resort if necessary, but evasion and movement tends to be his primary defensive options. One of the habits that Dominic Cruz will mention is how often Adesanya switches his stance and his use of various lateral movement. Now, Cruz was one of the earlier adopters of a style that relied a lot on movement and complete evasion of the opponent's offense, so he tends to emphasize why it's so important. Let's get to some of the details here to explain some of it. When opponents advance on Adesanya, he has a tendency to switch his stance. Now, switching your stance will take away your opponent's ability to score at advantageous angles. For example, in his fight with Kelvin Gastelum, Gastelum was moving towards Adesanya's weak side angle, and he was doing this a lot to score. You generally want to move to the opponent's weak side because that's an angle where it's hard for them to hit you, and they'll have a hard time hitting you due to bad body positioning. However, when Adesanya uses stance switching, he not only took away Gastelum's advantageous angles, he also changes the angle back to where Gastelum was now in his power side. From here, Adesanya can punish him through his advancements. This is a common trend that you see in a stylebender fight. You'll always see him changing his stance and changing those angles. It makes it hard to attack his weak angles because he's constantly changing them. Moreover, you'll also have to worry about him changing into an angle where you're now lined up with his power side. Another benefit to his active feet is that his legs aren't always in a static position, so if you were to shoot for his legs, his active lead foot makes it even harder for opponents to plan how they want to take him down. Adesanya emphasizes the importance of foot positioning and never being in a vulnerable spot where they can take you down. This is why active movement is an imperative aspect of his style.
Eugene and Andre, my wrestling coach, they alluded to is people forget the takedowns, the wrestling starts way before the clinch. Starts way before you get taken down or way before you engage. It's all about positioning, foot positioning. It's all about distance control. So once you have that and you understand the principles of that, your wrestling becomes easy.
This movement is actually one of Adesanya's go-to defenses, where he pulls his head away, he switches his stance, and then he steps out laterally, either by weaving or just simply doing a step away. This encompasses several aspects of defensive layers, and it makes it really hard for opponents to reach it. But let's break it down a little bit further and look at how hard it is to find an opening when he does this. He pulls his head back towards his rear foot to avoid the shots. And then he also switches his stance so that if they attack his legs or shoot for the legs, it's going to be hard to go for that target. And then he finishes off with a weave or stepping off laterally. Moving laterally is important because this actually mitigates the opponent's ability to follow up on him. So when you see opponents rush in on a straight line, by cutting an abrupt angle like this, it takes away the opponent's ability to follow up with their attacks. Another counter of his is the check hook. Now, just to give you a little bit more context about this specific counter, it's a shot that he throws while he moves his feet laterally. This is something taught by one of his striking coaches, Brad Quake Riddell, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to know more details about this specific counter. But in short, what the counter does is that it allows you to counter strike them while moving in a sharp direction, laterally away from danger. Now, this specific technique comes in handy for a variety of reasons. When Adesanya fought Robert Whittaker, there was one big problem that Whittaker presented in that fight. Early on, I mentioned that Adesanya feints outside of the striking range in case opponents try to counter. Whittaker seemed to know this, so what did he do to handle this problem? Whittaker actually closed the distance. If Adesanya was feinting from a safe range, all Whittaker had to do was advance while bringing his feet into range so Adesanya was no longer in a safe range. We saw this happen multiple times where Whittaker would identify Adesanya feinting from this bait range. Whittaker would brilliantly nullify the range using a volume of jabs meant to close the distance and put Adesanya on the back foot. However, Adesanya caught on to this. He caught on to the fact that Whittaker seemingly knew how to counter his feints. So how did Adesanya deal with this? This is where the check hook comes in. In order to counter the opponent countering his feints, he would purposely feint to draw Whittaker's forward movement. As soon as Whittaker pressed forward, Adesanya would cut an abrupt angle by firing that check hook. Since he's moving laterally, Whittaker is charging in at him at a straight line. He can't abruptly follow him. This is what makes a counter so useful in this situation. It gave Adesanya a way to counter, but also took away Whittaker's ability to press him back. This wasn't the first time that he's done this. Adesanya tends to use this on other opponents as well, like Brad Tavares. Tavares is finding a lot of success landing his overhand. However, Adesanya would find ways to punish it by baiting it out and then firing his check hook. His check hook don't always land, but from a technical perspective, it shows how well Adesanya can adapt to the opponent's best weapons. Along with his mobile footwork, he has several ways to punish the opponent as he's moving about. And here's a common one he throws, where he'll throw the hook while switching his stance. It allows him to punish opponents moving in while he could strike on his way out. And this just shows that you have to be very careful closing distance on him because he has several ways to attack on the go. Adesanya uses a variety of movements, so she'll always expect him to be very mobile, especially against the cage. He never really stays against the cage unless he has no choice. He tends to use lateral movement to escape or to sink his double collar clinch to mitigate the opponent's offense until he can reverse the position. The main meta of his game is really to hit and avoid getting hit. You'll notice this in his striking because he's very good at controlling distance. He'll often throw his offense and frame off the opponent to keep him at a safe distance where they can't attack him. Hopefully by now you have a better understanding of his fighting style, because what you get here is a patient fighter whose offensive style heavily relies on feinting and gathering reads to find that good shot. His offensive style relies on dynamic mobility, and he has a lot of ways of punishing aggressive fighters. And lastly, he's a very adaptable fighter. You saw that when he managed to find ways to use an opponent's tools against them by adapting to Tavares' overhand, adapting to Gastelum's lead hook counter, and adapting to Whittaker's stepping technique. But what Adesanya has shown in the cage, he's a very versatile fighter. He has several tools, both as an offensive striker or a counter striker. He's the type of fighter you have to be careful about in all aspects of the stand-up. Opponents have to be careful because if you make a mistake, he'll seriously punish you for it. If you like this analysis, please go to my WordPress page and make sure to bookmark it. I have a lot of exclusive breakdowns on there, and also have backups of my analysis work if they ever go missing here. Thanks again everyone for supporting my work.
I'm not giving up on it, my friend. I'm not giving up on that title.
Excellent. Congratulations. Thank you so much. Guys, back to you.
Oh! Wow! Let me see that. Out of here. Oh. Wow! Nah! No! Wow! Oh!